Good morning. Welcome to this Wednesday talk presented by Straight Nature and Kirstenbosch and Room to Grow. My name is Brett Chalcott. I'm the owner of Room to Grow. And before we start, I just want to say a couple of things about our sponsors. Firstly, to Straight Nature. Straight Nature is the leading natural history publisher in Southern Africa and associated with best-selling and most highly regarded field guides in the region. Straight Nature publishes full-color illustrated books across a variety of subject areas, including birds, mammals, reptiles, trees and flowers, the marine environment, geology, astronomy, general wildlife, and children's nature. And we're really grateful for them and the work that they do to be able to make these talks possible. Then Room to Grow. We're an exterior design and project management company that's been designing and creating outdoor living spaces in and around Cape Town since 2002. We offer a complete suite of landscape design, construction, and associated exterior design elements from our garden centre. And you can learn more about us on our website, www.roomtogrow.co.za, or follow us on Instagram or Facebook. And then it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Peter Carrick. So after some stints working in the waters off Antarctica and then the tropical forests of the Congo, Peter Carrick settled his ecological research in Namaqualand and received a PhD from Cambridge University in 2001 for his thesis on the region, and is currently an honorary research fellow at UCT. He established Nurture, Restore, Innovate, NRI, and received the NSTF Research and Innovation Award for their work. Peter has published many academic papers, articles, and reports, and is the co-author of 2 books, Best Practice Livestock Production Guidelines for the Namakwa District in 2009, and the International Principles and Standards for Ecological Restoration and Recovery of Mine Sites in 2022. His nearly 30 years of research into the ecology of the Namaqualand has culminated in the recent publication. Now, I've asked Peter's permission to say this in English, not in Afrikaans, but please note the book is only available in Afrikaans, The Ecological Restoration in Namaqualand, a Practical Guide. So before I hand over to Peter, if I could just ask that if you have any questions, you can chat them in the queue, you can pop them into the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you very much. As Brett said, I'm sorry, just trying to get my slides to go forward. Yeah, there we go. So I'm an honorary research fellow at UCT. I'm attached to something called the Plant Conservation Unit in the Biological Science Department. And I run an organization called Nurture, Restore, Innovate, which usually abbreviated as NRI. And we work increasingly in kind of the NGO space, advising and setting up, advising on land management in arid areas, and mentoring and setting up restoration and other land management projects. All right, I think without further ado, I will jump in. The book, as Brett said, is only available in Afrikaans, and that's really to make it accessible to people in the region. We focus on Namakwaland, but it's applicable definitely to the succulent Karoo and to many aspects of arid areas in general. I'm often in trouble with NGOs in these more popular talks for putting in too many graphs. So in this talk, I hope I have not done that. But in keeping true to the Afrikaans nature of the book, every now and again, I've interspersed an Afrikaans slide, which I will talk through in English. That is something usually taken from the book. So just to bear that in mind. All right. So the succulent Karoo, as many of you know, is the world's most diverse desert or arid area. It has, huge numbers of family, genera, and species. It's a widely quoted statistic, about 6,500 species. But what's really important, I think, is that about 20% of the species are succulents, and they also represent about 20% of the succulent plant species on Earth. So a huge proportion of the succulents on Earth. And this is actually unusual to have this high density of succulents within arid areas. Arid areas mostly have grasses and shrubs as the dominant life forms. It's the center of diversity for the Mesembryanthemaceae, or the Facies. We call them mesems as well. There's also huge numbers of crassulas, but the mesems have really exploded in our succulent crew, and I'll touch on areas about why that's important for restoration. So a little bit of theoretical background. When we want to talk about successes with restoration, when we publish academic articles, or even when we publish popular articles, we're generally looking for the generalizations. What can you say across arid areas? What works in the Namaqualand? And that's what's interesting to other people. But when we are trying to restore a particular place or deal with ecological or land management issues at a particular site, we have to focus on the idiosyncratic or the specific nature of that site, the specific soils, the specific species, and that's the understanding that's important. So there's this constant push and pull. What can we generalize about and use in other places? But what do we need to understand in this site, on this occasion, in this time, with these species, under these soil conditions, in order to make things work? So as a background, just bear that in mind as we go through the talk. The other thing to think about while we go through the talk, as a background, restoration is the recovery, the fixing, if you like, of broken ecosystems. So re-establishing ecosystems. It's not gardening, and we have to look at the entire ecosystem, and we have to look at entire life cycle processes. So this is useful in two ways. So when we're thinking about how to restore, it's useful to break it up into the stages of a plant. We have a seed bank, or we have seeds in the soil. The first thing is to get them to germinate. Second step is to get them to emerge from the soil. And then just to establish as a seedling, a young plant, maybe 2 real leaves will be an established seedling. Then that plant has to survive and grow to be a juvenile, and from a juvenile to an adult. And from an adult, it has to reproduce. And reproduction involves flowering. You'll see in your garden plants that are not in a happy place, that perhaps they're too shaded, they won't even flower. So the first thing is to flower, then they need to be pollinated, then the seeds have to develop, then the seeds have to disperse and survive attacks by predators or the seed eaters like weevils. And then the seed goes back into the seed bank or the soil, and it needs to be able to germinate and start again. So there are all these processes, and at each stage, there's a number of impacts that could happen, and there's a number of management options that one can take to improve the survival at each of those stages. So that's how we look at it in terms of restoration. But the other thing is to think about it in terms of successful restoration. All of these processes have to take place. So we're trying to establish self-sustaining ecosystems that will perpetuate themselves on their own. Okay. So driving through Namaqualand, this might be a typical scene in late spring, early summer. This is actually the N7 you can see, the great highway through Namaqualand. And particularly on the high-lying areas, in a good year, you'll see these fields of crops. So oats, barley, wheat, being cropped since the 1700s in patches. Some years, there's enough rain for it to be successful commercially. Other years, not so. In bad years, they become fodder for crops. So this has been widely done. And over these centuries, many areas have been cropped, although each year the hectareage that is cropped is quite small, and increasingly it's declining. So that's one of the main land use impacts. What it results in when left fallow, so after cropping, left fallow for a year or two, are the famous Namakwa daisy displays. So huge fields of annuals, mostly in Asteraceae, in other words, daisies, And this is what Namaqualand is famous for. I mean, it's interesting. Namaqualand has not an unspoiled coast, but an undeveloped coast, so wild and natural, but it's very little even discussed. Namaqualand in the popular culture is known for fields of daisies, which are very beautiful, but they're actually not very diverse. And they are early succession species that are the start of an ecosystem recovery. So in terms of ecological structure, it's quite poor, although pretty. So this is, I'm going to show a series of slides now. This is near Van Reinsdorp. And this is a project that's run by the Plant Conservation Unit and has been almost a life's work of Prof. Tim Hoffman there. And what he does is collect enormous numbers of old photographs from some of the first photographs in South Africa from early travelers, and goes back to that same spot later in time and retakes the photograph. So this is, yeah, as I say, near Van Reinsdorp. It must be fairly soon after a plowed field has been allowed to go fallow, and it's covered in your usual show of Namakwa daisies, the orange and the white daisies, Acinia, Dimorphotheca. That's what it looked like in 1960. And in 2003, it had changed. So from 1960 until 2003, more than 40 years, there's been very little recovery of perennial plants. So what you're seeing here now is mostly Mediterranean annual grasses that have taken over from the indigenous South African daisies. So you've gone from one early succession suite of species to another. The second one is alien, but the perennial plants have not come back. And this we find quite commonly, and I'll get onto that in a minute. So that's one thing that can happen. It isn't widespread, so it's generally just in the Van Reinsdorp region that these alien Mediterranean grasses have become so dominant. Something that's much more common. So this is another area in Namaqualand, photographed in 1940. And again in 2005. So that's more common. Areas are cropped, left fallow, and then cropped again. And so they start to recover. They go through the process of succession, first the annuals, then short-lived plants, and then over time, longer-lived plants should come in. Here's a site photograph taken in 1938. Cropping done in those days with donkeys. And this is what it looks like today. So this is also a widespread scene in Namaqualand. So this is kraalbos or Galinia africana, and over much of the Harderveld, it is the dominant plant in degraded areas, comes in with heavy overgrazing or with cropping. The seeds do get everywhere. They have a long dormancy, and very often ecosystems are turned to almost monodominant stands of kraalbos. So in this case, we wouldn't imagine that it was only cropped in those early years and then left fallow. It was probably recropped a number of times. And in fact, looking at this, I would say it's been cropped no longer than 5 years previous, but is now dominated by kraalbos. So this is up in the north of Namaqualand, the Steenkop area, a photo taken all the way back in 1902, when people were really reliant on these cereal crops for their needs, long before, you know, the Spars and the OKs, bazaars came to Namaqualand. In this case, by 2006, it has recovered to a perennial ecosystem. So these are mostly facies. This is a museum called La Poltia and a bunch of other things. The dark gray things are non-succulent shrubs. You can see a heerwolkie over here that's still being grazed bare. So it looks like this area is subject to heavy grazing, but it has recovered to a mature perennial ecosystem. Right. So taken as a whole, and this is work from Wesley Bell's PhD, using satellite imagery to identify areas that have been severely degraded over the whole of Namakwaland. The green spots are areas that are obviously degraded by recent cropping. The brown and the red areas over here are mined areas that have been severely degraded. So I'll show that in a minute. But although the area is small, the intensity of that degradation is really quite something. So mining has been a huge part of Namakwaland's history, starting in the 1880s or the 1870s with copper, transitioning to diamond mining around about the 1900s to 1920s. And we're seeing diamond mining in its late stages now. So diamond mining is becoming less and less of a thing in Namakwaland, and we're seeing the rise of heavy mineral mining. This has had a huge impact on Namakwaland, particularly the coast. So this is in the north of Namakwaland. Sorry, I've got to pop up on Zoom. Hopefully I'm back online and you can all hear me.
Yes. Oh, we've lost you again. There we go.
I'm going to try and override this thing. So it stays on. Okay. Hopefully we're back.
Yes.
So as I say, this is a photograph taken from the air in the north of Namakwaland near Alexander Bay. In the background here, you can see the Richtersveld. So this is the coastal plain, and these are mining scars. So you see point disturbances, you see trenches, you see mine dumps, and occasionally you'll see a mine processing plant. So the entire coastline from the air looks like this. It's degraded in patches for at least the northern 400 kilometers of the 800 kilometer west coast. And this is taken lower down, so a higher resolution, but this is the predominant feature. So what happens is you'll have a large mining disturbance that removes all plants, usually results in huge dumps of sand. And we have one of the strongest wind regimes on Earth in Namakwaland, the predominantly southerly wind. So that takes the sand and moves it north. If the mining disturbance is large enough, that sand will inundate the vegetation to the north of it, killing it. That vegetation then doesn't hold the sand in place, and that sand is liberated, and it continues north. So it's a snowballing kind of degradation called secondary degradation. And many of these plumes are 3 to 5 kilometers long. So very little of this area is currently being mined at all. But with every wind, the area of degradation increases. So the mining footprint increasing daily without any mining taking place. And some important areas like these Inselbergs called the Buchelberge are being inundated by some of that sand. Right. It doesn't need to happen. Huge success can be achieved with purely good management of the topsoil. So we recognize 3 kinds of soil. The deeper soil is in Afrikaans onderliggende deklaag. We just refer to it as overburden. So this is the deep soil that overlies a deposit in the diamond mining industry. The most important thing is the boergrond or the topsoil. Now, importantly, 90% of the seeds occur in the top 5 to 10 centimeters of the topsoil. That's also where you get most of your nutrients. It's where you get all your soil goggas, you get your fungi, your mycorrhizae, your bacteria, biological crusts. So the important dynamic parts of the soil are in that topsoil. Underneath that, so underneath the topsoil is the ondergrond or subsoil. That goes down to maybe 0.5 meter. It varies from site to site. So this is soil that is still fertile. It's good for plant growth. It's what I'd call a good growth medium, but contains very little seed and much less of the biological component that's so important in topsoil. If this is really well managed, and there's a number of aspects to that, I can't go into the details of all aspects of restoration in this talk, but key aspects of soil management are store the soil in small piles, not more than 1 meter deep, and for as limited time as possible. Like use immediately or up to 3 months is best. After 6 months, you're starting to get into trouble. They start to go sterile. You can get anoxic conditions, and seeds are either germinating and then not growing, or being eaten by granivores, insects, or just rotting through bacteria and fungi. So managed well and replaced in the corresponding order in a good way, you can achieve fantastic results. The most important thing within Namaqualand, with this incredibly strong wind regime, is to stabilize the soil. So I'm going to go through another series of repeat photos. These are taken by me at a certain site in the southern end of Namakwaland. So this is what the site looked like in 2004. In 2005, the soil had been returned to the hole. So first the overburden, then the subsoil, then the topsoil. And importantly, it is immediately stabilized with nets. These nets running in an approximately east-west direction are very effective at keeping the soil in place. The system for netting has been well developed. It wasn't initiated by us. It was actually developed by one mining company that was being proactive. We've tweaked it and think we've improved it a bit. But this is really the way to make things effective. And these nets can be reused multiple times on different sites if the restoration is done effectively and plants start to establish on their own, and thereby stabilize the soil and prevent blowing away. So that's 2005. At the end of the first spring season, things are starting to die off, but immediately a whole lot of opslag. Annuals have come up, things like something we call nutfoot, Mesenbanthrum cristaninum. That's the dominant one, but a number of other things. Oncocyphon is something that comes up very quickly. So although they die back, their roots will hold the soil in place. And already by 2008, the nets have been removed. You've got short-lived plants, so still early succession, but not annual. So a lot of these are Namaqualand, for instance. In the foreground here, we can see Zygophyllum. So we're starting to get perennial plants coming through. Things develop slowly in arid areas, but by 2011, there's a good suite of numerous perennial plants emerging just from the seed bank. So we've got now lots of succulents, lots of non-succulents, and a good diversity. The annuals are all gone pretty much. A lot of there's still some short-lived things in there. And then finally, by 2016, the shorter-lived things have also declined a lot. And yeah, we're into a field of diverse perennials. It looks interesting here because the dominant facie is in flower. And that was done solely by the good management of topsoil. Right, so if you don't have topsoil, what can you do? Or if your topsoil has been degraded by decades of cropping, what we always find, this is a study done in the Harderveld, but what we always find in intact and degraded communities is there are far more seeds and far more species of annuals in the topsoil than perennials. So in an intact system, so an undisturbed system, more annuals, but let's say in this study, 13 species of perennials. The blue ones are facies or leaf succulents. The red ones are non-succulent or so-called woody shrubs. The little orange one is our friend Kraalbos or Gallenia, which is dominant here. And then the grey are other things, often shorter-lived shrubs or what we call perennial forbs. The second bars just show abundance, so the number rather than the number of total plant, or number of total seeds rather than number of species. In degraded systems, still a huge number of annuals, but in this system you've got no feigids, you've got one species of woody shrub, you've got kraelbos and 2 species of something else. So the main problem, once the soil is stabilized, the main problem with degradation without good topsoil is a shortage of plants themselves, and plants usually in the form of seeds. One of the advantages we have in Namaqualand is that many of the plants are succulent. So this allows us to transplant live plants from where they're going to be degraded into areas that we're trying to restore. This is very useful in the mining situation, where new areas of pristine felt are being opened up by mining. With just a modicum of planning, people can go in there beforehand and take out all the plants that will transplant successfully. And here we've looked at a number of species that was done by a mine contractor. So these 4 are all mesems, succulents, and I am stressing these groups of plants, and you'll find in the book that's the main way we refer to restoration. The first way to divide up the landscape, to divide up our interventions, is to group plants into 10 to 12 groups and think about how each of those groups can be restored. So these are the feigids, the leaf succulents. So unsurprisingly, in some cases, 100% of them survived. In all cases, 90% or above survived. So this is actually only after a sort of a 3-month period. So over time, you expect a little bit less survival, but in general, it's good. And if plants have survived a year as a transplant, they've pretty much made it. What's interesting as well is that a number of other plants that were not succulents also did fairly well. 50 to 60% we would be very happy with. That's a fantastic result. So Zygophyllum in this case did very well. This Chaetobromus is actually a grass, so that was surprising. Some grasses can transplant, and this is a woody shrub, a different species of Gallenia. And then of course, this is a forb, this is another woody shrub, and another woody shrub here. So yes, many species are not suitable to transplants, but at least we have quite a few that are. So that's one arrow in our quiver to help the restoration in the succulent career. Another thing that one can obviously use is nurseries, and there's a lot to go into here, but nursery methods are fairly well established, so there's not much that we feel that we can innovate. There's 2 things to mention. One is that nurseries in Namaqualand can be fairly simple things. So really all we need is some shade structure. Again, the shade structure is as much about limiting the disturbance by wind as it is about limiting solar radiation. And we quite like these structures that come down to the surface at an angle, and that helps deflect the wind from inside the nurseries. Another thing that is very useful is innovations that are taking place in, you could call them pots. The Afrikaans is better, planthouers. And one thing we like very much is these cardboard box containers that can be made at a size suitable to the plant. They're made so that a number of them fit securely into a crate. They folded up. They can be filled with growth medium just by throwing a spade of soil on top of that crate. And then they can be planted out in the field in the box itself, and the roots will push through the gaps at the bottom of the box, and the box degrades fairly quickly over time. So very efficient, quick way to establish small plants and get them out in the field. Another option that is poorly used in South Africa is the option of creating seed farms of the plants that are important for restoration. So this is the Worcesterveld Reserve, and they have been a seed farm for at least 30 years now. There's also an independent group in Prince Albert called Renew Karoo that have also established a seed farm, but that's about it for South Africa. Worcesterveld Reserve, for instance, only farms 3 species. So within the area of interest, seed farms are underexplored and present an opportunity to really bulk up the seeds that are available for restoration. But there's lots to talk about with seeds, but I'm going to emphasize this point very strongly. So provenance is really important. It is not sufficient to just get the right species and plant that anywhere in South Africa. So the genotypes within species are very important. We often don't recognize them, but plants occur in populations within different areas of South Africa, and it's important to use the right population for restoration. Right, so as I was saying, the provenance, the area from which seeds come is important. I'm illustrating this with work from Alan Ellis's lab in Stellenbosch. So this is typical Namakwa daisy. This is what is largely regarded as 2 species of Dimorphotheca, Dimorphotheca pluvialis, the white one, and Dimorphotheca ursinea, the orange one. And that's typical Namakwa daisies, white and orange daisies. But in fact, there we go. They are part of a much larger species complex and are not 2 separate species, but are the same species, or they have growth forms or floral forms that are intermediate between the pure white one and the pure orange one. What is happening now is, because some of the white forms have been so widely available as seeds, people in Namaqualand have planted them in their gardens, and they are, if you like, polluting or diluting the local gene pool of the species, because across Namakwaland, these floral forms occur naturally in distinct areas. So these are some of the floral forms. This is a whole range of Namakwaland all the way down to Cape Town, and the different colored spots obviously represent different floral forms of those flowers. So using the wrong form in an area will change things quite considerably. And we see this in the dominant pollinators. So these are 2 species of bee fly, Megapalpus and Corsa miser. And you can see that whether it's the orange and white Dimorphotheca, or whether it's the orange and white ursinea, a different genus, Corsa miser always prefers the white flower, and Megapalpus always prefers the orange flower. So this divergence in floral color is being driven by the dominant pollinators. This is a much richer story. It involves sexual mimics in the discs on the ray florets of the species. It's incredibly interesting. These species are also pollinated by other generalist pollinators, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that the provenance or the genotype of the species that you're using for restoration is important. And we can see this here in a very colorful, obvious way through flower color. And we can see that it has implications for the rest of the ecosystem, in that it affects how and when and to what extent the plants are pollinated. But there's a million ways in which these genotypes could be different that we can't see. So we don't know what's happening at a biochemical level. We don't know what's happening in terms of mutualisms with, for instance, mycorrhizae or fungi. They could be very changed across the genetic spectrum of the species. So when we collect seeds, when we grow seeds, when we collect plants, it's important that they come from the area in which we want to do the restoration. All right. So the main method used for restoration across the world is seeds. And the main way for collecting those seeds is from natural populations in the area. There's a lot of detail that one can go into here. One has to think about where the populations are, when they're going to become ripe. Then you go to collecting them, then they need to be dried very quickly in an efficient way, otherwise rot will set in. They need to be cleaned, they need to be stored, and one has to think a lot about pests, weevils and such for storing. And after a period of storing, before they go out into the field, they need to be prepared for that and then set out in the field in some way. And this is where a lot of research is taking place globally now. So seed enhancement technologies, and this is showing great potential. There's a huge number of innovative ideas. Many of them have not been proven yet, but they are being worked on by multiple labs, particularly in Australia and North America. And yeah, I'll go into some of those. So one of the most obvious things is to try and protect the seed. So in this case, we're seeing a coating on the seed that deters granivory, or deters the eating of seed by whatever it may be, insects or small rodents in this case. Seeds can also be put together in some sort of matrix or extruded in a pellet so that they clump together, and that pellet can have all sorts of additives. Obviously, fertilizer or nutrients would be one. Surfactants, something that helps the water to infiltrate the soil, would be another one. And the pelletization is quite useful because it often overcomes difficulties that one has with a seed. So seed coating is a technology that's used a lot in agriculture, but natural, indigenous, wild seeds are not like agricultural seeds. So they come in different sizes, even within a same species. They come with all sorts of difficulties like awns and coverings and hard seed coats and pods. So all of those need to be processed or broken in some way. So there's various ways of removing them, but something I'll show you in a minute is a flash flaming technology that simply burns off the bristles and awns of certain kinds of seeds. And then another innovation is providing hormones that can either break dormancy and help seeds germinate faster, or more importantly, for arid areas, you can create dormancy. So let seeds germinate in the year following in which they were set out. And in the arid areas, this is important because you will get rainfall and plants, seeds will germinate, but there may not be follow-up rainfall. So those plants will then die. Or if we could have a way to provide different levels of dormancy with one process of setting out the seeds, we can have seeds that will germinate over perhaps as many as 5 different seasons, and hopefully one of those will have the right rainfall regime to carry the plant through from germination all the way to a juvenile plant and adulthood. Right, so this is a slide showing the flame technology. So it's simply a large swirling machine that creates a vortex for seeds to move around in, and then just has a flamethrower which will turn this heavily awned spinifex seed into something that's much more easy to coat and won't clog any of the process or any machines when it is set out in the field. Other ideas have been this sort of thing. So HPP here, everybody loves an acronym, but this stands for herbicide protection pod. So it's particularly useful in areas where you have a massive problem with exotic or alien plants, and North America particularly, again, with Mediterranean grasses. So a herbicide can be applied to these areas beforehand, and then these HPP pods of indigenous seeds set out, and they are largely, the mechanism is largely activated charcoal, which protects the seeds from the herbicide and allows them then to establish and grow in this wonderful ecosystem that at that point is free of competitors because they've been taken out by the herbicide. Here again is a pod with simply covered in a surfactant. A lot of desert soils, when they get very dry, they actually become hydrophobic. So instead of the water penetrating the soil, it runs off. But in this case, these seeds are coated in a surfactant, which when wet infiltrates the soil, breaks the hydrophobicity and allows the water to infiltrate. So like I say, one can continue to have good ideas and try them out. Many of these are not tested at scale yet, but this is a real growth area for restoration. Another thing that's taking place in America and Australia is innovations around the setting out of seed. Again, these are sort of borrowing from the basics of agriculture. On the left, you can see a seed drill and a number of different hoppers. So that allows you to put a number of different seeds into each of those hoppers. And it has a very small plow-like object, which turns over a small amount of soil and can seed differently. The real innovations here are kind of micro and technical. It's about, again, creating hoppers that can use these very unusual seeds that are not as clean and not as round as agricultural seeds without getting stuck, and deliver them into the soil at rates that are appropriate. On the right, you have something that's called a slot seeder. So that can now be towed behind a simple 4x4. It doesn't have a plow at all. It simply has a spike that creates a groove in the ground, and then seeds of different types can be put in at different rates. You can also fill the hopper with chaff, with rice, or vermiculite, any sort of thing to thin out the seeds to adjust the rate. And so they can be delivered, your precious seeds would not be wasted, but delivered at the most appropriate level. The use of the 4x4 and the thin trailer without a plow is very useful in natural areas where there's been some establishment of annuals or a few species, but you need to add more species to bring in the perennials or get up the diversity. There's a lot more on this subject, and inevitably the future is all going to be about drones, particularly if you read the marketing material. And so there's all sorts of things that are going to be done there with pods that can contain a seed, but also just the right amount of mycorrhizae and nutrients to get that seed going. There's definitely a future here, but we are not trying to create landscapes like this. So this is, some of these technologies that borrow heavily from farming are creating the wrong kind of seeding for our ecosystems. Our natural desert ecosystems typically look like this. So this is just the Kraalbos dominated one. But even here, what we see is the same as intact or pristine ecosystems. There's not sufficient soil, not sufficient water in arid areas for there to be a full cover of vegetation above the soil. So you'll always find areas between patches of plants, we call them interpatches, and then patches or mounds or fertile islands where plants occur. So even with Kraalbos, over a period of say 5 years, the roots extend much wider than the plant, and those nutrients are brought up into the plant, they turn into leaves. The leaves fall and then they rot below the plant. It also provides a good habitat shelter for animals, lots of insects. The plants trap windblown material, they trap other organic matter. So you build up a mound that is quite fertile under the plant. It often has more burrows by burrowing animals. So it creates better infiltration. The organics help to create better infiltration. And most importantly, there's higher fertility in these mounds. And that's how we would like to roll out the restoration. in these natural systems, many plants only recruit. They only survive if they're protected by an adult plant or sometimes a dead plant. So this is a quirketworm, an Alodicotyma, growing up within Riccia, a little feigie. And pretty much all these aloes start their life that way. They did not establish in the open. They only established in the protection of other live or dead plants. So we call this niche seeding. We're trying to recreate patches. We're trying to establish plants only in patches. As I said, the main intervention we have is seeds. Seeds are very limited. They're only produced in small numbers by natural populations. It takes a long time for people to gather them. And in South Africa, we have an abundance of people who seek work, and they can, lives can be changed quite substantially for what is on a global scale a very meager wage. So it provides us with an opportunity to try and improve people's lives and do restoration at the same time. So rather than use all these high-tech mechanized techniques, a lot of our research is aimed at using techniques that would employ local people. One of the most important things in getting this niche seeding going and creating these patches is the simplicity of digging a hole. Digging a shallow hole creates a depression in which organic matter starts to collect. Seeds can collect. Of course, if we do it, we seed them, and we do a number of other things to recreate those patches. But simply creating a depression in an arid area, it collects organic matter and it collects water. And the results can be phenomenal on their own. So this is just outside Berrydale. And here we see these were seeded, but every depression over a period of about 5 to 10 years has a good suite of perennial vegetation cover. The second most important thing is to create some form of shelter. Where plants are available, we can use brush shelters, which is over here on the left. And there's lots to be said about brush shelters. Where plants are not available, we've innovated the use of a cardboard box again, just to create some protection from the wind, create a sheltered habitat, some protection from the sun. And it's both of these are shelters that will biodegrade over time. We've tried a number of things over the years. Again, it's all about what works in the system. The devil is definitely in the detail. Some shelters work, some don't. Some plants like shelters, some plants don't. In the beginning, we thought round shelters would be the way to go. They deflect wind. But what we found is they do deflect wind, but they also create vortices of wind within them. So soil movement on the surface within round shelters is still quite dynamic, and that impedes plant establishment. So we found the cardboard box to be the most effective. It also biodegrades. You don't have to worry about removing it. It's simply carbon going back into the soil. There is a lot of detail here, and most important is setting up the cardboard box in such a way that it doesn't collapse inward and squash the plants. So that has to be done in a certain way. If you'd like to know how, get my book. I'll be happy to tell you, but thought I better plug the book somewhere. All right. Something else that happens in fertile islands is what happens in the soil. So in these two slides, you can see the addition of a small amount of nutrient and a reasonable amount of organic matter. Sometimes we collect organic matter from under shrubs, which will also have the benefit of bringing the kind of bacteria and fungi that occurs there into the soil. It also can bring seeds. What's important is to think about not only what you add, but how much you add. So here we have a graph. This is actually a glass house trial. So this is done under very controlled circumstances. And yeah, we've used kelp as a form of organic input. It also helps to bind water in the soil. It does often come with a lot of salt, so that's the negative. and then we've used a usual amount of nutrient, which I'll explain in a minute, and then we've used double the nutrient, and we've done that for 3 species. But the complexities of ecology are largely removed in this process because we've done it in a glasshouse, so the soil's the same, there's no wind, watered in an exact way, the solar insulation is the same, and you can see the response is very different. So this is a Feichi, Stiberia, and it really responds badly to kelp. This is a control where we add nothing. We use a water holding sodium gel, much like you get in nappies. The response to that was quite good. But the plant did respond to nutrients. Adding more nutrients did nothing. In Zygophyllum, which is a non-succulent, the gel was not particularly effective. Zygophyllum responded to kelp, responded to nutrients, and responded a little bit more if you gave more nutrients. In Atriplex, or saltbush, had a massive response to kelp, and the more nutrients you gave it, the more it grew. So if you have a look at the y-axis, you'll see this is by far the biggest response. So a control, you're getting a biomass index of kind of 0.2 up to 1 or 1.2 under the kelp treatment. So Atriplex responds very strongly to the input of nutrients and doesn't mind the salt that comes along with the kelp. Therefore, the addition of nutrients is important, but if you find something works well and you think, well, let's use more and more of it, you may well be in trouble. So these little pictures illustrate what might happen in one of our restoration packs with a cardboard box. So you've got 2 species. They managed to germinate and establish with an addition of some nutrient, small amount of nutrient. All of them grow a good deal further, but with the addition of too much nutrient, certain plants are going to dominate. They're going to take advantage of that nutrient where others are unable to, and consequently they'll overgrow the slower growing ones. So that's really important, and we stick strongly to the adage that the amount of nutrient that should be added is sufficient to take the soil up to the amount of nutrient that one would naturally find in an indigenous system fertile island. So we only raise the nutrient up to that of a fertile island. Again, the devil's in the detail, but as I said, our rule is a good rule of thumb. Certain plants respond to nutrients, certain don't. Certain plants respond to boxes, others don't. I labored the point earlier about the magnitude of the response of plants in the greenhouse. And that's because I wanted to show you some bad news. So as much as we have many interventions or many methods for doing restoration, we are still somewhat overpowered by what's going on in nature. So this is showing again, now we're looking at the top, we're looking at abundance, at the bottom we're looking at biomass, so similar to what we saw in the glasshouse experiment. And these are different soils within a mining area. That's why they have such weird names. They refer to mining blocks. But you can see block 3, for instance, is a soil that had a mining area that had no topsoil. And there's very little biomass of, we put in something like 20 species, very little biomass over a long time period in those plots. If you look at LK6, a massive biomass. So, of course, areas with no topsoil, we expect to do worse, although for these non-succulent shrubs, they didn't do too badly. But the other sites that don't have the yellow are topsoil sites, and there's a huge variation. And this is just in biomass, but of course we also see variation in which plants establish and how long they take to grow. So as much as we have many methods for doing restoration, the situation on the ground is hugely complex, and we don't have a full understanding of that all of the time. In this series of trials, we used a mining site with very different soils. We expected very different results. But where we've used old crop sites with very similar soils, or we thought they were similar, and we tested various aspects of the soil chemistry, found them to be very similar. Unfortunately, we see almost as much variation as you do here. So site is very important, and it's a complexity of things. It's all about the kinds of microbes that are in the soils as much as the soil chemistry itself, or its aspect, or its exposure to wind. So that's one thing we can't overcome. But we have many of these innovations, and we see them as incremental. So using seed enhancement technologies, and then using niche seeding in its various forms, we're able to keep adding a 10 or 20% better establishment rate. So we do have this kind of thing happening. So this is a close-up photo within a box or restoration pack. Going back to what I said at the start of the talk, this is seeds establishment. So this is germination, leading to kind of seedling establishment, moving on to juveniles. And these, as the juveniles become established and start to develop towards adult plants, you'll see the boxes biodegrade, and plants establishing in those plots. I'm going to not go into the details of this. With our technical details troubles, we've gone a little bit over time, but every area is different. Every kind of dominant shrub is different. So it's hard to draw generalities, but what we do see, by and large, if I have to say one thing, may not necessarily apply to the phagids, but in general, we're seeing that the provision of some sort of shelter. So here we see brush packs, here we see boxes, is always, well, not always, but is generally more beneficial than all the things that we do to the soil, particularly the adding of nutrients. So again, the patch dynamics are important, particularly shelter. The last thing that we can do is to roll it out at scale and to use the innovation of nucleation. So this again is to recreate patches. You can see this now at the many hectare scale. So here's a patch of boxes or restoration packs, and you can see them across the landscape. So we group those together again. What you can't see is there's generally some transplants that have been put in, live adult transplants in between the boxes. This is an old mining site. The other thing you see here is this is not well managed topsoil, but you've got what I would call better growth medium and no growth medium. So here is the big white patch is where there's been no growth medium. So nothing that contains some of the topsoil at some stage, whereas the darker patches are things that had a seed bank at some stage, but it was poorly stored. So the diversity is very low, but you do get enough plants establishing to stabilize the soil. But this idea of doing things even at patches at the larger scale that come somewhat mimic Ekologiese, plant boxes or groups of plants can then also help to provide protection to each other and attract things like birds, which bring with them seeds. And so these patches can grow. So finally, this is basically the entire restoration in one sequence, taken again in north of Namakwaland. So this is an area, an old mining area, in which soil was replaced in 2008. Half of the area was netted to stabilize the soil. And the other half, they just didn't get around to netting in 2008. If you look carefully at the netted area, you'll see some yellow in there. So once it got netted, there was sufficient seeds in this, again, poorly managed topsoil, but there were sufficient seeds to establish. In 2009, the rest of the area was netted, and immediately opslag annuals established as Onchocyphon and Mesembryanthemum again. They took off immediately, but the diversity was very low. So in 2010, we put in restoration packs with a suite of perennial seeds. You can see again, There are other plants coming up outside. This is still Mesembryanthemum crystallinum, but again, you've got short-lived things like Silocolon, Didelta is in there. And by 2013, some of the restoration packs had established a diversity of perennial plants. Others had not, but the boxes had already degraded. You can see that they didn't collapse inside, they collapsed outside. And although in some ways the vegetation cover looks barer here, these are all good long-lived perennial species that are then resilient to the summer drought. And at this stage, the nets could come off. Right, thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can get my video to work. I'm not quite sure what to do, but let me try. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was fascinating. I knew it would be complex and integrated and full of complexities, but that was amazing to get I know I can't have covered everything, but to have got such a broad overview of everything was fantastic. Thank you very, very much. We do have some questions in the Q&A, so if I would like to go to those, and I think we can just work our way through them. I think you did touch on this, Peter, with regards to the balls. From Carly, are you using the concept of permaculture and gorilla seed balls? These have been used in Jordan and China, for example. Is that something that you're looking at?
Yeah, so I'm having no luck getting my video going, but yeah, many of the concepts of permaculture we use, and the basis is the same. So understanding the ecology of natural areas and trying to mimic that is something that permaculture is. It's something that we use. And so, for instance, creating the depressions is used in various ways in permaculture, creating swales. Sometimes this is done on farms as well. We use seed balls or seed bombs in our own way. So yes, there's been quite a lot of work with that. Some people simply kind of use dung and put seeds in there and create little balls and throw them out. We do that, but we do it in a more developed way. So, you know, this niche seeding, we refer to it as using restoration packs. And a restoration pack is designed, it's not a thing, it's a concept. So it's designed for the situation you find yourself in. So again, almost always we'll use a depression. Sometimes with veegies, we won't use shelter, but often shelter is a key component. And then we use various kinds of soil ameliorants. So certainly we would use dung if we had that available. We've tried the kelp. We've obviously used lots of nutrients. For us, it's key to use a form of nutrient that breaks down slowly and breaks down by natural processes. Because some of the commercially available slow release nutrients, they actually release the nutrients proportional to the temperature. So higher temperatures, more nutrient is released. And that doesn't work for us in Namaqualand because under high temperatures, we have no rain. So we want stuff that simply releases nutrients by rotting. So we tend to use more organic fertilizers just because they release nutrients in the right way when plants are growing. The other key thing is, I think, much like some permaculture, we always put a diversity of species into each restoration pack, up to 20 species. And those are chosen firstly by their growth form or their functional type. And these, like I said, are quite simple, 10 to 12 different groups of plants. And within those key groups, we would use a few different species. So that's the kind of way in which we work.
Oh, fantastic. We've got another question here from D. What success do you have with re-establishing pollinators in the restored areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. And what the zoologists tend to say is, as much as engineers are maligned for saying we'll build it and people will come. Plant ecologists are maligned for saying we'll grow it and the animals will come. So we haven't worked a lot with re-establishing animals of any sort. What we have done is an extensive study. We took something up to about 15 experts up to Namaqualand, and we worked for 10 days. And they were experts in fields ranging from fungi and bacteria, all the way up through insects to small mammals and birds. And we looked at a series of recovering ecosystems that again the focus had been all on the plants, and looked at to what extent did these other groups of organisms mirror the recovery of plants. And luckily we found it was very good. So in fact, the best correlate of all groups recovery was plant abundance. And we had the weirdest one were the insects. So we did find that insects recovery was strange, and we've gone on to look at that with a master's student. The species can be different to natural systems, but what we found, and these are sort of really only pilot studies, there's a huge amount still to understand there, but the sort of the functional groups of insects wasn't that different. So if you looked at decomposers, for instance, as a very broad functional group, they were represented in both the restoring and the pristine ecosystem, but the species within those suites were somewhat different. But it is a good question, and particularly for Namaqualand, because there is an argument that these great floral displays are really plants competing for limited number of pollinators, and there's a plethora of things going on with pollination and plants. We've got the daisies and the phages that sort of have quite generalist pollinators. They're quite a generalist flower type for pollinators, but the things that are generalist all over the world, bees and butterflies, are actually not doing much, are absent and not doing much in Namaqualand. And we've got these other groups, bee flies, monkey beetles, falling into those niches and being the generalist pollinators there. So it's again, an idiosyncratic system.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to group a couple of questions here together on the same thing. Roger and Jill have asked about who pays for the good work, and then Carly was asking if interested members of the public wanted to get involved. If so, how could they do that? Yeah, well, payment is a big issue. So that's one of the reasons why we work with mines. We feel very strongly that in a mining scenario, those that have caused the degradation should be the ones to fix it, or at least to pay for fixing it. Some mining companies step up. There are still on the coast one or two very responsible actors. And then unfortunately, there's a large number of irresponsible actors. If mining companies don't restore their degradation, as I showed in that early on with those slides, secondary degradation results, it doesn't magically fix itself over time. If you don't have seeds in the topsoil, they really take at best decades or centuries to get there. But with rolling degradation under sand plumes, it's never going to restore, because that's a bigger problem than just seeds. That's a problem of unstable soils. With farming, it's more difficult. I mean, there is in the farmer's interest when they have realized that cropping doesn't work. It is in their interest to turn it back into a perennial felt, not because the productivity of a perennial felt is higher than the productivity of a field of annuals. Annuals might give you a good crop of plants for sheep, for instance, in winter, but they provide nothing for sheep during the difficult dry period of summer. So perennials allow you to run animals on your farm throughout the year. The restoration is expensive. Sometimes it's prohibitive for farmers.
more than 40% of Namaqualand is now communally owned. So it's not privately owned, and it's not possible to get people to pay for the restoration of communal land from their pocket. But what we do have in South Africa are the EPWPs, or the work creation projects, like Working for Water. And I remain hopeful that those projects can be used to roll out restoration in Namaqualand and other areas. Beyond that, we're reliant on donations and the public good, and also volunteers, as you said in your question, Brett. WWF is becoming more and more involved, becoming a big thing for them. And there's another NGO, Protect the West Coast, that is really highlighting some of these issues for Namaqualand. We welcome volunteers. It's probably more than I've already rambled on in this question, but if I were to talk about issues of volunteering, it would take too long. It's I think that the key thing is it's a long process. When people often want to start a restoration project tomorrow. If you start a restoration project tomorrow, you'll be lucky to plant the first thing or to walk onto your degraded site and do something good within a year. So there's a lead up time of at least a year, and that is pretty much spent collecting seeds. And that's before you can even think about doing something on the ground. And there's always a rush to plant things. That's great. I don't want to diminish that. But the first step should really be, what are you restoring to? So think carefully about what your ultimate objective is. And this is again too complex, but you need to think about that, but it also can't be too refined. You might have an idea to grow a specific species. There may be, as I say, there's all these site effects. That specific species that you like may not be appropriate to that site. So essentially, you have to give your degraded ecosystem a choice of options, different species, and the ecosystem itself will choose those that are most appropriate. Of course, we don't do this blind. We have a pretty good idea of what is going to grow, but I always provide a lot of common or generalist species and a variety of those. Let me leave it there for that question.
Thank you. Then I'm going to combine a question here from Christina and from Eugene. So Christina is asking about are grasshoppers a problem in the area, and if spraying pesticides to eradicate, does that affect the natural pollinators? And then Eugene is of the view is that what is your view of the locust as an ecosystem biogeochemical recyclers? And as such, should we not be using pesticides to poison them en masse? So just two different ideas there about the grasshoppers.
Yeah, those are interesting questions. And in my time in the Karoo, I've encountered hopper swarms a few times. I haven't thought a lot about it. In the area we work in Namaqualand, thankfully, it has never been an issue there. If you were to use pesticides, yes, it would affect all other insects, and so it would affect pollinators. But the locust swarms that we've had fairly recently in the more Eastern Cape, or on the Eastern Karoo, perhaps is a better way to put it, they've been devastating. And when we look back on the historical records, they've been it's really been devastating, some of those swarms. There was a dedicated government research group that looked at the locust swarms, and they had brought them under control in the last, I don't know, at least since the 80s. Interestingly, the swarms, although smaller, had been moving further west. I'm not totally up to speed, but I believe that research group is diminished or sort of abandoned. So I think we are potentially leaving ourselves open to future massive devastation by locust swarms. I think there have been innovative outcomes. I really think we need to fund that research, and it has worked well in the last decades. There is the use of some pesticides, but I know there have been some other innovative methods for controlling them. And there's a good understanding now from this research group. I'm not up to speed on it particularly, but sort of what sequence of years leads to large hopper swarms. So they have a complex life cycle, the locusts, and they go from hoppers to flyers. And I think, in fact, that the pattern mirrors a kind of El Nino pattern. But yeah, one would have to look at that specific research.
Thank you. Victoria's got a sort of double-edged question. I think you answered the first bit. Her one question was, how do you determine the seed mix in the restoration? And you mentioned about the 12 or so niches that you use to then determine what you're going to put in. But then she's asking, how do you protect the natural population and not compromise it when you're collecting seeds? Do you have a protocol for the amount of seed that may be collected from a population, especially when you're using sort of large scale and people employed to do this?
Okay, yeah, great. So I think I've answered the first part sufficiently. Obviously we choose seeds that are appropriate to that vegetation type and appropriate to the soil. So if it's a more saline site, we'll choose those. But always put in some generalists. This functional group is key, and of the say 10 to 12 functional groups, about 6 of those are key and are always used, and then depending on the site, some of the others may be used. What we do in terms of collecting seeds is simply to follow the Northern Cape protocols. So one needs to get a seed collecting permit, and the requirement there is that you don't collect more than 20% of a population seed. So we try and stick to that. Obviously, there's sometimes, it's hard work collecting seeds, and some of the collectors might collect more than that, but we pretty much never go back to the same population again. So you'll hit it, if you manage it right, you hit it at its sort of peak production of seeds. You strip some of those out, but the seeds will continue to be produced by those plants, usually in lower numbers, and so those will all be available for the system. The other thing to say here is that in seed collecting, choosing your populations and choosing your plants are key. So there's a lot of strategy. If you can find a nice dense population that's seeded well, you're going to have a much more success than a dispersed population where you're walking through the veld. And if you concentrate on those great plants that are just covered in seed, you collect a lot of seed quickly, and you actually skip the plants that only have a few seeds on them.
Great. And then Javi and Adam, I think their questions overlap here. Can the rehab process revive an extinct or near extinct species? And do you also restore niche endemic special species?
Yes, good questions again. We obviously can't, bring back extinct species. There is a large concentration of species of special concern, and the kind of what I call the rare and specials, they are important in the system. We unfortunately don't put the majority of our work there. It would be great to put more emphasis there. But the important thing for the rares and specials is that they generally have much more narrow niche requirements. So you cannot restore those in the first pass. you've got to bring in the common things. You've got to create the structure. So there's structure in the landscape, which we haven't spoken about that much, but we have spoken about it in one way, and that is that the patch dynamic. So if you create these patches of plants with sheltered environments, so-called nurse plants, those are usually the habitats for your rare and special. So if you think about bulbs, for instance, they often need to go in under other plants. And so with these kind of rares and specials, it's a second pass or a second stage or phase of restoration. And it's something that needs to be highlighted. Very often we find the appetite has diminished once you've kind of got some green stuff there and the landscape is stabilized. The appetite is diminished to go back and put in the specials. Sometimes they'll get there on their own, but it's a good point. The corollary to the point is that a focus on rares and specials without getting the structure of the ecosystem back is completely misplaced. So you'll see a lot of EIAs that focus on search and rescue. Plants are not blocks of Lego. You can't take them from one place and plonk them down another place and hope that they will be okay. If you search and rescue rare plants, but you don't have the right environment in which to put them, you are essentially just spending a lot of money to kill plants. So I think that's key. If we're going to go after search and rescue, we have to think very carefully of getting the receiving environment to be the right one for those plants. And very often it's also not possible because those rares and specials are picking out some sort of patch in the landscape that is peculiar to their requirements. So there might be a limestone patch or a saline patch or a specific pollinator regime or specific way in which the plants are dispersed. And if we've gone into, for instance, post-mining landscapes where all the soils have been homogenized and turned over, that variation in the soil is lost and the niche will not be there for a very peculiar kind of rare and special plant.
Right, thank you. And then finally, just two questions from Michelle. One is regarding does the fog contribute to the available water in the Namaqualand, or is your work further inland and more dependent on the winter or summer rainfall? And then the other was, she's mentioning that they'd rescued some plants from the Richtersveld, and the wind regime obviously moves the sand around. And she's asking, would it therefore be logical to assume that the seed bank is also moved around by the wind?
I'll take the second part first because, yeah, it's an interesting take. When the soils are mobile, I guess the seed bank is being pushed around. But what you've got to remember is that these are not beans that you grow in your garden. These are even the large seeds are very small compared to agricultural seeds, and the small seeds are like grains of sand. All the feigiets, for instance, the seeds are no bigger than a grain of sand. So they do not have the power, they don't have the resources within the seed to push through more than a centimeter or two of soil. So the seed bank does get moved with mobile sands, but it also gets swamped, it gets lost, it gets buried under other sand. In intact systems and in moderately degraded systems, the soils themselves will not be moving, so the seed bank is in place. So yeah, that's what we're hoping for. Once the sands get mobile, you're in trouble. The question about, was the other question about mist and fog?
About fog, how does the fog, is your work affected by the fog, the moisture, or is your work further inland and that's more affected by natural rainfall?
So most of our work is in the succulent Karoo. So it's winter rainfall. We work less in the Little Karoo, which has a more year-round rainfall. But the critical thing about the rainfall in the succulent Karoo is it's comes in small rainfall events. So 6 millimeters is actually the average rainfall size of a rainfall event in the succulent Karoo. So it's different to the Namaqualand or the more eastern Karoo, and different to the sort of Highveld, where you have these big storms, thunderstorms, much larger quantities of water in a short space of time. So although rainfall is small in the succulent Karoo, it's delivered in a way that is great for plants. So often a rainfall event will extend over a day, much like we have in the Cape, but with much smaller amounts. In the Namaqualand, that is concentrated in winter, which is also good. We do work on the coast where fog is important, but the rainfall events themselves are, as I said, are these frontal rainfall events. So even the rain behaves in a way that is often similar to fog. It's often a sort of light misty rain, and it's accompanied by these cold fronts that are, as you know, come with a high wind factor. So even the rain moves horizontally rather than vertically. So what we see is the structure of the vegetation is important. Where you get these bush clumps, they are probably concentrating much more rainfall below their canopies than sort of you would measure with a rain gauge. Because the rain is moving horizontally, the minute it bumps into anything, it sits there and drops. The mist works or the fog works in the same way, and it's certainly a useful input along the coast. And places like Port Nolloth have a huge number of fog days a year. It is interesting to see how that penetrates, and lower lying areas, sometimes in the Richtersveld, the Knausvlakte, for instance, that fog can penetrate quite far inland and is useful source of moisture. So yeah, all of those things are basically pluses for the succulent Karoo, even though the total rainfall is small.
Well, that's it, Peter. Thank you so much. And I think by the number of questions and the interest on all the chat here, I think I speak for everybody when saying that was fascinating and extremely interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this Wednesday talk. I'll just to let you know, our next talk is Wednesday, the 23rd of November. A reminder that Peter's book is available to all registration, all people who registered at a 15% discount for this week from the Kirstenbosch, from the Botsok Library and from the Kirstenbosch bookshop.co.za. Yeah, thank you to Straight Nature and to Sanby for hosting, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, Peter. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.